Go ahead, Nick. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning, or at least this morning in Eastern Time, or 4 p.m. for Mr. David Pearce here. So welcome to this little chat put on by the Futurist Foundation. My name is Michael, and I will be talking with David Pearce today. David Pearce, as you know, is a prominent figure within the transhumanist movement. He's one of the main co-founders of the World Transhumanist Association, which later became Humanity Plus, as I'm sure that you're all familiar. And he approaches ethical issues from a what's called a utilitarian, negative utilitarian perspective. And I've got some questions about that we can get into very shortly. David, can you shift a little bit to the left again? There you go, perfect. All right. And David is also an advisor to the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies, and also still actively an advisor to Humanity Plus, which again is just like the rebranding of the World Transhumanist Association. So he's a very active and renowned transhumanist. So it's very exciting to have you here today. So for myself, I'm just volunteering here. I am just a volunteer at the Futurist Foundation. I've got a couple other things on the side, but we don't need to spend time talking about that right now. So for today, what we'll be talking about is really taking a tour de force to really get to know you, David. What we want to talk about is, first of all, how you got into philosophy and transhumanism, how you see what the future should be like, and getting a sense on what you think we should be doing to make that possible, how you actually got started, getting into some more details about your field of expertise. And then finally, as we get towards the end, we'll start talking about where you want to go next in terms of making all of this possible. So it's a lot to talk about, and I'm very excited to be talking with you here. Shall we begin?
That'd be great. Thank you, Michael.
All right, wonderful. So just starting off, I mean, what really got you into this whole thing about transhumanism and your view on how the world should work? What got you started?
Well, I think our overriding obligation is to tackle the problem of suffering. The rather forbidding name for this is negative utilitarianism, but it's really just secular Buddhism. And to me, at least, and this is not the position probably of most transhumanists, our obligation to phase out experience below hedonic zero and replace it by gradients of intelligent bliss, that is the absolute core of my approach. Yeah, from an early age, I have thought about broadly transhumanist themes. Like many small children, I was troubled by the problem of death, and yes, I wanted to find a cure for the aging process by the time I was 18. And when I realized this wasn't possible, I stumbled across Robert Ettinger, The Prospect of Immortality, i.e. cryonics. And yes, I've been interested in issues of intelligence amplification, nootropics, cognitive enhancers, without, of course, anticipating Ray Kurzweil or the so-called intelligence explosion scenario. But yeah, what has really preoccupied me from a very early age has been the problem of suffering in human and non-human animals. And yeah, in 1995, I wrote The Hedonistic Imperative, this manifesto that calls for phasing out the biology of suffering and replacing it with gradients of intelligent bliss. And a young postgrad at LSE called Nick Bostrom stumbled across the manifesto, and this was back in 1997. And with some difficulty, he persuaded me that I really was a transhumanist. And so, yes, we set up the World Transhumanist Association. A lot has happened since then, but I still, if asked to give a lightning synopsis of what transhumanism is all about, I go for the three supers: super intelligence, super longevity, and super happiness.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll definitely get into those details very shortly, because that's definitely a big thing that we want to get into as well. I want to dig in a little bit more about this interaction with Nick Bostrom, if that's okay. So, what sorts of conversations were you having with him before you two decided to actually start the organization?
Well, I think Nick was probably feeling a bit intellectually starved at LSE, and yeah, he came across the hedonistic imperative, and he fired off a couple of relevant questions, criticisms. What would be wrong with simply on this kind of scenario, creating just blissful brains in vats? And on a classical utilitarian scenario, there isn't, on the face of it, anything wrong with creating blissful brains in vats. Indeed, arguably, if we can do so, there is a moral obligation to do something similar. Now, in practice, there would presumably be selection pressure against any predisposition to practice wireheading or anything like that. But yeah, if one is a classical utilitarian, then yeah, it's apocalyptic in its implication. Should we be really aiming in the long term to convert the world's matter and energy into utilitarian matter and energy optimized for pure bliss? I mean, whether normally it's negative utilitarianism that is associated with button pressing scenarios. Would you end the world to get rid of suffering? But in practice, it's classical utilitarianism that has extremely apocalyptic consequences too. Anyway, yes, we talked, debated, and yeah, then set up the World Transhumanist Association with a kind of declaration of principles. Commitment to the well-being of all sentients was as number 7. I would put it number 1. But yes, I mean, obviously there is a certain irony with someone who has become associated with the field of existential risk, setting up something like the WTA with a negative utilitarian. But yes, I would argue that these seeming tensions can be reconciled, and that most, if not all, transhumanists would favor this kind of triple S civilization. They would just give very different weight to the different supers, and I would say probably 2 of very different conceptions of what post-human superintelligence would be.
Yeah, fair enough. Actually, I was wanting to talk with you about the the Transhumanist Declaration next. So we might as well get into that. So you said that, well, item number 7, we advocate the well-being of all sentients, including humans, non-human animals, and any future artificial intellects, modified life forms, or other intelligences to which technological and scientific advance may give rise. So it sounds like you prefer that would be ranked up, but even so, like, you've got 8 different very powerful concepts there, and like, how did these 8 different concepts get arrived at? Like, were there particular ones that were the originals then got added on, just because it looks like this current form was formally adopted in 2009, but it got started in 1998. So like, what was like the evolution of this document?
Essentially, it's a collaborative effort with many different opinions solicited. As I probably don't need to tell you, transhumanism is a very broad and diverse movement, but all sorts of people contributed to this the declaration, just as they did to the frequently asked questions. I mean, if anything, since then, the transhumanist movement, has become more diverse. Some might say more fragmented or balkanized. But I think one can trace the continuities too, in the sense that I'd say all transhumanists believe in defeating the biology of aging. I mean, there are some transhumanists focus very much on biology. Others, because worries about kind of realistic timescales, focus on cryonics or even cryothanasia. Others anticipating something like mind uploading. Very speculative. I'm a skeptic there, but nonetheless, that super, I would say, all transhumanists would sign up to. In the case of superintelligence, intelligence amplification, once again, I think probably all transhumanists would agree, but there are strong differences, different current conceptions of superintelligence. After all, the very notion of intelligence is strongly contested, and simply adding super in front of it isn't particularly illuminating. Crudely, and I stress crudely, I tend to divide conceptions of post-human superintelligence into people who anticipate that our successors will also be our biological descendants, genetically rewritten, massively enhanced and augmented, and perhaps sort of new AI on a neurochip. You know, think of Elon Musk's Neuralink, but still, nonetheless, anticipating post-human superintelligence as us, or rather, retaining a biological core. And then there are the Kurzweilians, the kind of singularitarians, who essentially believe in a complete fusion of humans and our machines, so that there ceases to be any distinction at all. Many Kurzweilians believe in a kind of mind uploading scenario. But there's also this conception of post-human superintelligence. Essentially, it originates with I.J. Good, mathematician, back in 1965, developed hugely by Eliezer Kautsky and Miri, and formalized Nick Bostrom in his magisterial superintelligence. The intelligence explosion in the sense of recursively self-improving AI that is software-based, and the idea of some so-called FOOM scenario of runaway software-based superintelligence. And superintelligence in this conception essentially might have no place for anything resembling humans, as this worry of will post-human superintelligence be sentience friendly. So crude trichotomy there, but all transhumanists would probably subscribe to some notion of superintelligence.
Right.
The other super, the final super. Okay. Sorry,
I mean, keep going. We have a question, but it'll wait. Yeah.
The third super, I would say only a minority of transhumanists make this their main focus, i.e. the idea of getting rid of suffering in favor of super happiness. The argument being, for example, that, well, if we have super intelligence, superintelligence will be able to do this anyway. But this is the idea, that thanks to natural selection, unspeakable pain, misery, and suffering in the world, depression, pain disorders, but biotechnology promises control over our reward circuitry. And this is the thing that I really stress. It's not a question of blissing out, that if we can recalibrate our hedonic range and recalibrate our hedonic set points, it'll be possible to have a novel architecture of mind, life based on gradients of intelligent bliss. And I think this was what really interested Nick. as I need to stress, intelligent, very, very important to Nick. And the idea that it was possible to have an architecture of mind that was entirely well-being based. And if you have life based on gradients of intelligent bliss, it doesn't involve changing your core values and your preference architecture. It just means that your default settings can be immeasurably higher than today. And I think the abolitionist project, it should be extended not just to all humans, but throughout the living world. Trivially obvious, well, at least I would say it's trivially obvious, we should get rid of the horrors of factory farming and slaughterhouses, cultured meat, which back in 1995, 1998 was still sci-fi. It's coming. This revolution is coming. So let's hope we can get factory farms and slaughterhouses shut. But
actually, let me just cut you off there briefly, because we will talk about animals and farming later. So we'll have plenty of time to talk about that. Before we move on, I do want to go ahead and mention this viewer question, because it's related to, well, would you say that you are on the 2045 train, like Global Future 25, or some like timeline made famous by Ray Kurzweil? Or what is your timeline, if you have one, that transhumanism will really become global?
I'm a skeptic of 2045. I confess. I mean, it's very seductive, and it also it's more likely to have resonance with people if you tell them that, you know, the great transition is going to be within your credible lifetime, 2045. I'm skeptical for multiple reasons, and that for technical reasons, I don't think classical digital computers are ever going to wake up. I don't think they can solve the phenomenal binding problem. The binding problem, just in case anyone is unfamiliar with it, is why aren't you just a micro-experiential zombie? Just as, you know, the 500 million odd membrane-bound neurons in your nervous system of your gut, the enteric nervous system, aren't a unitary subjective experience. Even if they're micropixels, why aren't you just 86 billion membrane-bound pixels of experience, as you are when you're dreamlessly asleep? That phenomenal binding is tremendously functionally, computationally fitness enhancing. The fact that we can experience multiple perceptual objects apprehended by unitary self, unity of perception, tremendously adaptive. Just how adaptive it is, one can see, and syndromes where binding partially breaks down, like simultanic nausea, where someone with
sorry, I'm not quite understanding what you mean by the word binding still. Like I'm a little bit more used to like, well, I have a little bit of neuroscience training, but very incomplete and mostly more like cell science related. So by binding, what that means to me is like surface receptor binding, like ion channels, like ligand-gated ion channels and stuff like that. But this is clearly a different sort of binding.
Yeah, I was trying to. If philosophers know it as either the binding or the combination problem. It's often credited to William James. This is the mystery of if, you know, your skull is opened up and a neurosurgeon probes, when you see, let's say, a perceptual object, that individual edge detectors, motion detectors, color mediating neurons can be detected, but seemingly no unified perceptual objects, hence the expression, which is due to Phil Goff, micro-experiential zombie. Even if you think consciousness is fundamental to the world, or even if you think individual neurons are, in some sense, support rudimentary experience, how is phenomenal unity possible? How can you experience individual perceptual objects within your world simulation? How is it possible to have a unified self and a unified world simulation? because if we assume that orthodox neuroscience is correct, that your brain can be understood classically as a pack of neurons, binding seems to be physically impossible. How the central nervous system, the brain carries it off, extremely controversial. It's one of my themes I'm interested in, I've explored. But I would say what's worth stressing is that it is incredibly adaptive to be able to do this. Imagine if you had simultanagnosia, for example, and you could only experience one object at once. Just imagine what it would be like on the African savannah, pride of hungry lions, and you can only see one lion at once. Now, someone with simultanagnosia still has a high measure of binding, but there are other syndromes, for example, motion blindness. Someone with motion blindness can't actually experience motion. They can see a car, or for that matter, a lion in the distance, then a bit nearer, then a bit nearer, then boom. Tremendously adaptive, this capacity to be able to experience motion. But how is it possible? And then there's global binding, the unity of the self, the unity of perception. Right now, you're experiencing this kind of world simulation, multiple dynamical objects. How is this possible? It's incredibly adaptive. In the case of computing and AI, to get back to your original question, a lot of people do assume that sooner or later, digital computers are going to wake up and become conscious subjects of experience. But just as a thought experiment, imagine replacing the ones and zeros of a classical Turing machine with just discrete pixels of experience. This is fanciful, okay, but and then execute the code. Short of strong emergence, magic, essentially, however complex the code and however fast you execute it, all you have is a micro-experiential zombie. You don't have any form of phenomenal binding. You don't have a unitary subject of experience. And as I was indicating earlier, the fact that biological minds, animal minds, do have this extraordinary ability is extremely adaptive. So back, as I said, back to where we started from, I don't think classical digital computers are going to wake up. I think we can, yes, include Neuralink prefigures this kind of neural chip so that you or your elderly or older, I should say, self will be able to do anything a classical digital computer can do and more. But nonetheless, you're a subject of experience. You can talk about consciousness. You can explore different state spaces of consciousness. Whereas a digital computer, it's just a zombie. It doesn't understand the pleasure-pain axis or why anything matters. It can't explore altered state spaces.
Fair enough. So I think that nobody would really dispute that, at least with current computational technology, there's no way to recapitulate the level of complexity and like regulatory feedback mechanisms that biological brains can, implement and undergo. Because like obviously biological neurons are super complicated. Like Purkinje cells have tens of thousands of connections. I think those are Purkinje cells. It's complicated, and you cannot just type your way through a Python program and just create something that reflects that. It is obviously complicated. And will there be some period of time at which it becomes possible to emulate the relevant mechanisms like cell-cell signaling and gene regulatory feedback stuff? I would be in the camp that says yes, but I am not going to commit to a timeline. So I'm definitely with you in terms of it's complicated. Does that make sense?
Yes, as I said, unless you want to go into a discussion of quantum mind, yeah, I haven't outlined how I actually think the mind brain actually carries off what is classically impossible. But no, I don't, because I don't think classical digital computers can solve the binding problem. I think there are a whole host of things that organic minds can do that are beyond the powers of a classical Turing machine. This is an unorthodox view, but it's testable. I mean, in the sense that if phenomenal binding is not a classical phenomenon, then the non-classical interference signature in the CNS will tell us.
Fair enough. It definitely does sound like at least some aspects of that would be testable. And I mean, to be fair, like quantum effects are definitely real in the CNS. Like simplest case, photons just like jumping around inside your rosicones before causing electrical signaling to start. And there's a couple things I'm blanking on right now, but they do exist as well. So jury is still out. And I think it's a very interesting thought, for sure. It would be cool.
Yes, I should stress that in some ways my physics is orthodox. My working assumption is there's nothing but the unitary Schrödinger evolution. I'm not proposing a radical theory like, you know, Hameroff, Penrose, Orco, or anything like that. I mean, as you know, the main argument against any form of quantum mind is decoherence. That if, as I suspect, what seems to be synchrony, binding by synchrony, is really superposition. The lifetime of neuronal superpositions in the CNS is femtoseconds or less, so which is intuitively the reductio ad absurdum. But one person's reductio ad absurdum is another person's falsifiable prediction. And I predict that when we can actually probe the CNS at sufficiently temporally fine-grained resolutions, we will find a perfect structural match between what you're experiencing right now and the underlying physics. And it's the alleged absence of a perfect structural match that leads David Chalmers, for example, to take seriously dualism, because if there is no perfect structural match, then dualism or something like it is true. Just as ultimately what goes on in your kind of PC, ultimately it must be reducible to machine code or else it's magic.
Oh, sorry. What do you mean by dualism? Just to be clear.
Dualism. There are different kinds of dualism, but on the face of it, there is this fundamental ontological distinction between states of consciousness, subjective experience, raw feels. There's this distinction between subjectivity, first-person subjectivity, and the world described by physics and chemistry, third person. One tends to make this extremely plausible assumption that the world's underlying fields are fields of insentience. The fire in the equations is non-experiential. So if this is true, then the mystery arises of the hard problem. How is water turned into wine? And the dualist says, well, there is simply no way on pain of magic to turn water into wine, and which is why David Chalmers has excited, at least in certain circles, interest in dualism. I said I most certainly am not a dualist, I'm a physicalist. But if we are to retain monistic physicalism and the unity of science, then a revolution is going to be needed, and an understanding of the nature of the physical and understanding of the nature of the mind-brain.
Cool. That's just a whole world that I'm not familiar with. It's really cool to hear. Yeah, it's just one of those things that is just like, there's this whole other thing going on. Again, like I'm used to thinking about neurons, and basically anything biological is just like a blob of goo that, you know, does stuff with a fairly limited instruction set, and it's just totally different view on the world. So it's really
yeah, so Turing machines, as
yeah.
we know, are substrate neutral, and the assumption is that one can model the mind-brain via a classical Turing machine. Therefore, it shouldn't make any difference if you replace your biological neurons with functioning identical silicon neuron. But then you have the hard problem, then you have the binding problem, then you have all manner, it's a chamber of horrors. Having said this, anyone listening who doesn't feel the binding problem is significant can probably switch off anything anything that the weird stuff about quantum mind. It's only if you take the binding problem seriously and you think the binding is classically impossible that you'll be interested in exploring exotic solutions, and that most people are familiar with and take seriously the hard problem. Fewer people are familiar with the binding or combination problem.
Okay. All right. That was really cool. So we should probably keep moving here. Let's see. So what should we do? If we're done that. Oh, yes. So something that was a little bit maybe interesting for me to run across was a interview put on by Andre Laminia, where you're talking with Nick Bostrom, I believe, and you said that you are a pessimist by temperament. So that's a little bit of a surprise based on what I've read of your work so far. So I'm just curious, like, what do you mean by you're pessimistic? What does that really mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, it might seem a bit ironic that someone who thinks the future lies in gradients of intelligent bliss, orders of magnitude richer than anything accessible today. It doesn't sound like a particularly pessimistic philosophy, but yeah, this is just for technical reasons. I think for mastery of our reward circuitry and the universality of the pleasure-pain axis in sentient beings means that this is our future. But yeah, just in terms of my temperament and belief, I just think that Darwinian life over the past 40 million years or so has just been stained by absolutely horrific suffering. And it's not as though I think that this transition to post-Darwinian life somehow deletes this unspeakable suffering from space-time or Hilbert space or whatnot. And as far as I can tell, there is absolutely nothing we can do about it. But yeah, I think we're our forward light cone, if you were to go into 1,000 years hence, ideally a few centuries hence, there just simply won't be experience below hedonic zero. But nonetheless, I think Darwinian life has ugly surprises still in store for us, lots of ugly surprises. And my conception of reality as a whole is very bleak on account of suffering. I mean, most transhumanists tend to be optimists by temperament, life lovers, and I think indeed the future belongs to fanatical life lovers. I think Darwinian life is absolutely monstrous.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's certainly not the I guess main way of conceptualizing the future that I guess transhumanists are more familiar with, but it's really interesting, and it's there's definitely a lot of a case to be made that you have a point there. There's definitely a lot of ugly things in nature, so that's definitely worth acknowledging. So you've definitely got a good point there. So with that, I think that we could probably transition to something a little bit more detailed, and that is starting to understand more about your viewpoints on how to reduce suffering in the wild, and also to reduce suffering associated with livestock agriculture, for example. So yeah, so like overall, like what would you say is your action plan? What would you like to do first? If this is a hard question, sorry, but like, you know.
Obviously, I think factory farms, slaughterhouses should be shut now, and it's crazy to talk of compassionate stewardship of the rest of the living world when we're still systematically harming sentient beings in factory farms and slaughterhouses, when we're systematically asphyxiating sentient beings by fishing and all manner of horrors like that. So I think that's a priority. Realistically, the fastest way to get global veganism is going to be the cultured meat animal products revolution, which can be done in conjunction with ethical arguments. And I think one way forward would be, as the first cultured meat products hit the supermarket shelves, I think there should be legislation that kicks in, kind of delayed implementation, perhaps, that all factory farms and slaughterhouses become illegal by the year, let's say 2030. Now, I think what we're doing is an unspeakable, monstrous crime, but just as human slavery, it wasn't that essentially it was instantaneously abolished. It took decades. I think it would be politically realistic that once cultured meat and animal products actually do hit the supermarket shelves, I think that the transition is going to happen in that, yes, once people realize that it taste and texture is identical, that cultured meat animal products needn't be genetically altered in any way, I think the transition is going to happen, but we should accelerate it as much as possible. And I would favor lobbying to essentially have legislation enacted that just simply outlaws animal agriculture.
I've got a small question, actually, just while we're on this. Have you tried Beyond Meat? And if so, what are your thoughts?
I haven't personally. I mean, I've never tasted meat, so I wouldn't be able to pass judgment on whether it tasted like the real thing. I mean, personally, even the term meat, I recoil from in disgust, yet I'm aware most people don't have this reaction. So to be successful, essentially, we have to make the inconvenience to consumers minimal to non-existent. And I suspect that when cultured meat products do hit the shelves, there's going to be a lot of ostentatious choosing, the ethical, cruelty-free product. And so the revolution will occur. And so it's going to be a case of just doing everything we can to accelerate the transition. And just as human slave owners, the British Empire, were compensated for the loss of their property, I would imagine farmers, animal abusers, factory farm owners, yes, I won't be in the least surprised if they get compensated too, but essentially whatever it takes. So yeah, essentially I think there is going to be an ethical revolution this century that follows, probably at least in part, in the wake of the cultured meat revolution. And it's going to be a question of what then? Do we aim to essentially preserve traditional nature red in tooth and claw? A lot of people find it very beautiful. David Attenborough has just launched this new series, A Perfect Planet. He's obviously not unduly exercised by the problem of suffering. But yeah, once we have stopped systematically harming non-humans, I think we need to tackle the problem of suffering in nature. A combination of CRISPR, genome editing, and much more counterintuitively, synthetic gene drives makes the level of suffering in nature an adjustable parameter. Gene drives, people don't know, can be used to cheat the laws of Mendelian inheritance so that you can spread very rapidly, in the case of sexually reproducing organisms, desired characteristics across an entire species, even if the mutation in question carries what is naively a fitness cost to the individual. Now, synthetic gene drives are first almost certainly going to be used to defeat vector-borne disease in Africa. You know, something like if you make all Monophilus mosquitoes, if their offspring are of the same sex, you can drive a species extinct. But the very same technology, i.e. CRISPR-based synthetic gene drives, and this is just an example, can be used to spread low pain genes. I mean, something like the so-called volume knob for pain, the SCN9A gene, has dozens of different alleles. Nonsense mutations eliminate the capacity to experience pain, but they also eliminate nociception, the pain response, the ability to respond to noxious stimuli. And that wouldn't be viable yet. But if one, let's say, chooses a benign low pain mutation or allelic variation of SCN9A, one can spread this desired mutation across entire species, kind of remote management, even of parts of the biosphere that are extremely inaccessible. I mean, naively, one might think, well, however we're going to tackle the problem of suffering in the Amazonian rainforest or deep marine ecosystems, but it's tractable. And I used to, when I wrote Humanistic Imperative, I used to invoke Eric Drexler and nanotechnology. I mean, I couldn't have anticipated gene drives, but yeah, and what is going to be possible with pain is going to be possible with hedonic set points, hedonic range too. It's in terms of timescales, chronology. I mean, one might think, well, first of all, why don't we ensure that all prospective parents are given the option of choosing pain thresholds and approximate hedonic set points of their future children? But what is possible for humans is also possible for non-humans too.
Okay. On that note, I do have a question with respect to a objection to the hedonistic imperative that pain and negative emotions are, or at least have been, evolutionarily adaptive, and that the abolition of suffering may threaten our, for example, human existence or non-human existence for the creatures thereof. And also, like, on a related note, like, how do you safely consider removing just like these perceptions from the the actions, like protective actions that a creature might take to protect themselves from a painful or noxious stimulus?
To be viable, one needs to preserve the functional role of pain and at least some of our negative emotions. It's not clear to me that we need to preserve the raw feels or the functional role of something like sexual jealousy, but anxiety or pain perception, it's vital that we preserve nociception, for example. But and one way to look at this is to study today's outliers, whether in terms of pain perception or mood. In the case of pain perception, as we know, as well as people who are extremely sensitive to pain, there are other folk who describe pain as, it's just a useful signaling mechanism. And yeah, essentially, I think we need a debate, discussion, and research as a preliminary step of making sure that all prospective children, for example, have an extremely high pain threshold, but not abolishing pain altogether. I mean, there are rare cases, as we know, of people born There's congenital anesthesia, congenital insensitivity to pain, and they have to lead cotton wool existences. There are anomalies. Last year it was quite widely publicized, year before last now, the Joe Cameron case. This was 72, 73-year-old vegan retired Scottish teacher. She thought she was completely normal, never got anxious, never got depressed, but also she discovered that she didn't have a normal pain response. She waved away painkillers for what would otherwise be an excruciating trapeziectomy. She regarded childbirth apparently as a mere tickle. There are at least a small minority of people who do seem to get by with minimal or no raw feels of pain at all. But that would be, I would think, too dangerous, at least for now, short of neuroprostheses. Most people don't yet want to become cyborgs or anything. But the civilized thing to do, I would say, is simply to choose people within the normal range of pain sensitivity and ensure that, everyone can regard pain as essentially, quote, just a useful signaling mechanism. In terms of the far future, is it going to be possible to get rid of the raw feels of any experience below hedonic zero at all? Yes, I mean, I think so. Only one example to use is just as lovemaking is generically pleasurable throughout, even though it involves peaks and troughs. There doesn't seem, in principle, any reason not to have an architecture of mind that is entirely pleasure-based, and moreover, that one can ratchet up hedonic range too. If today's hedonic range is, let's say, -10 to 0 to +10, mastery of our reward circuitry means that in the further future, how far I don't know, one could have a civilization of, say, +70 to +100. But critically, information sensitivity must be retained. I'm glossing over, as you might imagine, all manner of pitfalls. For example, at the moment, I don't know what the figures are in the US, but in the UK, something like 1 in 7 children ends up in casualty each year with some minor, generally some minor accident or something like that. And it's just accepted as life, the rough and tumble. That once prospective parents are able to take control, a sense of hedonic set points, pain sensitivity, and so on, there will be mishaps, there will be disasters, there will even be tragedies. And this is Darwinian life. If you, at the moment though, if you create a child, it's a unique, untested genetic experiment. But in future, in a sense, one will start being able to load the genetic dice in your children's favor, and with all manner of ethical pitfalls there.
Fair enough. Okay, so I've got a couple related questions. So we've currently been going on for about 50 minutes now. I don't think that we have a hard stop on the hour, but even so, just to be conscious of time, I think that we can probably keep moving a little bit. So, just to kind of keep going, one question is, has Humanity Plus been everything that you wanted it to be? Or if it hasn't, would you say that it's below or above your target? There's a hesitation there.
There's a hesitation. Essentially, I am a writer and researcher. Nick has essentially got where he wants to be as a kind of researcher at the Future of Humanity Institute. The set of skills involved in trying to build an organization, it calls for an entirely different set of skills than that of being writers or researchers. And it is extraordinarily difficult to build an organization given how disparate the transhumanist movement is. Even my three supers description, not all transhumanists would be comfortable with it. Some would add more supers. Essentially, it's extraordinarily difficult. Personally, and I stress this is this is the first personal view. I think calling the World Transhumanist Association humanity plus. I mean, I understand the rationale. Some people are comfortable with the term transhumanist. Some people confuse it with transsexuality. But yeah, I'm very comfortable with calling myself a transhumanist. I hope we become transhuman and then post-human. But the branding issue, given everyone knows us as transhumanists, I think we should be transhumanists. But yeah, it's very if you detect any hesitation, it's essentially it's an impossible job, I would say. I mean, the influence of transhumanist ideas has massively grown over the past two decades, but the transhumanist movement itself has splintered and splintered again, and is very balkanized. And I think there are still there are tensions between different currents of transhumanism. There is the kind of traditionally there was the kind of extropian libertarian transhumanists associated with the West Coast, and this is the reason for why Nick had to persuade me about setting up the W. I mean, I associated transhumanism with extropianism and the WTA. And but there are so many different currents of transhumanism, so many different conceptions of, for example, super intelligence, that whoever is running and involved in a transhumanist organization. And yeah, for the first decade of the century, the World Transhumanist Association was the Transhumanist Association. It's an impossible job. It's easy to snipe from the sidelines. But yeah, you try taking on an administrative or leadership role.
Yeah. So I want to get into that a little bit more. You said that regardless of the organization itself taking on such a big challenge, you said that transhumanist ideas have been starting to take hold in a broader context, even despite obviously some differences in views and priorities. So a couple of related questions. Do you think that transhumanists can come together for the most part? And what does the movement need to succeed? Or maybe we can say plural. What do the movements need to succeed?
Good heavens. Well, yeah, I mean, clearly I would like to see much greater cross-fertilization of ideas. I mean, I could call for unity, but equally, does one call for a very kind of flabby consensus, intellectually flabby, that glosses over all the differences? As I said, different transhumanists and different transhumanist groups would obviously want to prioritize their own ideas. As I said, there's someone who thinks our biggest problem in every sense is the problem of suffering. I think suffering contributes to what is commonly called existential risk, global catastrophic risk. Clearly, I would like to see the well-being of all sentients absolutely central to transhumanism rather than just one of its currents. But this is a minority view, and I'm sure you'll have other guests who would say that our overriding priority should be tackling solving the problem of aging. Others would tell you that yes, that we face kind of a challenge of an imminent intelligence explosion, AI safety. So in terms of how this is going to work, It would be nice to say that transhumanists had mastered the art of truly transhuman politics, but sadly, yeah, I still think of us as, and I would, wouldn't exclude myself. Essentially, we are still chimpanzees in our basic emotions, repertoire. How one achieves a truly transhumanist politics? Can one reach transhumanist politics without mastering the Machiavellian dark arts? I mean, there are now, as you know, transhumanist parties, transhumanist politics, but yeah, daunting challenges. And yeah, I mean, I can come up with a few superficial generalities and so on, but I don't have really, I couldn't seriously offer you pat answers. Sorry, a bit of a lame response.
No, that's fine, and it just kind of signals just how big of a set of challenges it is. Like, how do you get all of these different groups with partially, at least, maybe even substantially overlapping interests, but still some differences, and they have to be able to stand up for what they personally believe in without sacrificing that in a way. So it's just like a big question how you can have people aligned and help each other out in a way that succeeds at accomplishing all the things that each individual would be interested in, just because it has to be appetizing for everyone involved to actually grab their involvement, or else why would they do it? So it's a tough challenge for sure, and that's still a challenge that we are working through at the Futurist Foundation as well. Is just like, how do you get all of these related but still separate interests from people who have who kind of have to report to many different masters like every day, to come together and make something is tough. So yeah, I get it, but we can still try, and as long as we agree to at least help each other out a little bit, just like as a movement, even if you have to maybe do a favor in a aspect that you're not as interested in, then someone else will do a favor for you that benefits your movement, and you've got like this building mass of what I would personally view would be like a collection of good actions that is just worthwhile to do. So actually, another transhumanism movement related question is, what do you think it needs in order to be seen as a serious movement? And that is another tough question.
Well, it is a tough question. Serious as viewed by who? You see,
that's the question too. Yeah.
Yeah, because if one is writing for an academic audience, one wants to write in an academic style, publish in peer-reviewed journals, impeccably sourced in academic language. On the other hand, if one wants to relate and be accessible, then yeah, a very different style is called for. Yeah, and generally speaking, if one has a really radical message, one wants to make the presentation as sober as possible. So, so I find, this is just the super I focus most on. In the case of getting rid of suffering, humans and non-humans, often it's good to kind of stress historical continuities. If you've got a really radical idea, for example, let's reprogram predators, stress that it's all in the Bible. Isaiah, the peaceable kingdom, lion lying down with the lamb, all transhuman. One is urging as a transhumanist is, yeah, the technical details being inked in, or but it's tricky. But yeah, I think we need a much higher level of professionalism. We also live in a fame-based culture. So if Elon Musk, for example, says, I mean, this is my private fantasy. Elon Musk says, yes, let's use biotechnology to eradicate suffering throughout the living world, reprogram the biosphere. If he makes this one of his side projects rather than a 10 trillion colony on Mars, then it suddenly becomes feasible. I mean, this sounds like the naive great man theory of history, but given our worship of fame and success, yeah, I think the breakthrough may well come because someone really famous makes the cause his own. I very much hope too that Zoltan Istvan, he exploded on the transhumanist scene from nowhere, but Zoltan's media contacts are, and yeah, I would think perhaps if transhumanists could work.
Sorry, could you repeat that, please? Your video just broke up for like a half second. So
I was
Zoltan's
just saying
media contacts.
In terms of, I think Zoltan is probably more than anyone realizes that, yeah, in terms of maximizing one's impact, yeah, go to the kind of the mainstream journals, papers, and so forth. And so if it's, yeah, a media strategy, a PR strategy that is truly professional, and but yeah, the details I don't know, but yeah, when we were starting off, well, and I was starting off back in Hedonistic Imperative in 1995, and then WTA 1998. This was the very early days of the World Wide Web, when it was an achievement to put up a website and to get everything functioning. Yeah, this, the Wild West days of the internet. But the whole media landscape has changed. This was before the days of social media. But yeah, essentially a much higher level of professionalism. But also, I think we need to a much greater degree of unity and cross-fertilization as a movement. And it's never as exciting, building bridges, diplomacy, alliances, having conferences together. It's never, well, for most people at least, it isn't as exciting as setting out one's ideas. But yeah, the current balkanized state of the transhumanist movement makes, how are we going to evolve? I don't know. I mean, as you know, there's quite substantial overlap with effective altruism. But yeah, in terms of how the ecosystem of transhumanism evolves, I don't know. And in terms of my own design limitations, as I said, I am a writer who can, with difficulty, do a bit of talking, but I'm not psychologically robust enough to get involved in transhumanist politics, let alone deal with some of the challenges of, kind of organization building. It's
understood. I mean, it definitely takes a diversity of skill sets and just talents and experience and such. And well, for what it's worth, I do have to disagree with you about what you just said, that you're not quite as good at talking. Like, you are, well, this is a really good interview so far, so I really appreciate it. You might not.
I was thinking more of my hormonal status, that essentially, yeah, there's nothing before about 2007 of me standing up and talking. I mean, yeah, enjoy being asked, but yeah, essentially, oh God, what's going to go wrong? Disaster. One can't formulate careful responses. But yeah, I can write, and to some extent I can talk, but that's yeah, yeah.
Well,
as you were saying,
then
though,
again, have you I mean, at least based on some. Nah, I shouldn't get off on that tangent. Never mind. Never mind.
Ideally, one shouldn't need leadership. This is obviously it would be wonderful if everything were completely collegiate and democratic, but in practice, with our Darwinian biology, the transhumanist movement needs effective leaders and spokespeople, and the ability to deal with stress, to risk offending people if need be, but never to needlessly offend. It's intelligence is so much associated with IQ scores, SAT scores, and so on. And it's the kind of Asperger's conception of intelligence that IQ tests reflect, whereas full spectrum superintelligence will not involve simply an off-the-scale IQ, but also an off-the-scale ability for social cognition, cooperative problem solving, politics in the broad sense. And it's desperately difficult. As Eliezer Yudkowsky famously said, politics is the mind killer, and it is very, very cognitively demanding.
I mean, speaking from a little bit of personal and organizational experience here, both Nick and the TFF board and myself, I just serve as a advisor / volunteer, and also my role at the Futurist Foundation. Like, all of it is very high in terms of cognitive load, because you have to balance like various competing interests, and like you said, you have to be willing to not offend people inordinately, but on the other hand, you do need to be able to give critique in a fair and constructive way, or you need to be able to respectively disagree with someone, and stuff like that. And also, at times there's a little bit of horse trading, a non-speciesist replacement for the phrase horse trading, if you will. But there's just like a lot of things that you have to consider, and it's definitely tough. So yeah, I completely agree with you on that. The next thing that I'd like to get into, just because we're kind of coming to a natural close here, is I would like to get a feel for what you're up to now. Like, if you're writing on something like a big project now, like, that'd be really cool to talk about. And then another thing that I'd like to get into is, would you like help from anyone here, or anyone that we could potentially reach out to help accomplish whichever projects you have going
on? I think my next project is probably going to be a physical paperback. Very primitive, I know, and it's got a tentative title, The Biohappiness Revolution. I back in 1995, I wrote this online manifesto, and good friend Magnus Vinding brought out a collection of some of my essays. But essentially, I want to have a physical, hard copy overview of the abolitionist project as I conceive it, and also sketching out, and this is really important, a kind of glorious future of life based on gradients of superhuman bliss. And I've learned from experience that it's really important to stress the good stuff, just how sublime our future could be. That because I'm, secular Buddhist, negative utilitarian, I am very, very focused on just the horrors of Darwinian life and the moral urgency of getting rid of it. But most people switch off if you talk too much about suffering, or at least are only prepared to tolerate talk of suffering if you're explaining how, life is going to have a happy ending. and yeah, in some sense, getting the balance right between stressing just how dreadful suffering is and how much non-human animals are suffering, and getting this kind of balance, but also stressing a glorious future. And it's not, as I said, my tentative prediction, in spite of being a dyed-in-the-wool, button-pressing negative utilitarian, is that our future is going to be indescribably, unimaginably glorious. And what's more, a 100-year plan, if there were global consensus behind it, could probably work. In practice, I think probably hundreds, maybe more, of years of suffering lie ahead. In terms of how you could help, well, perhaps I'll think about this, but let's perhaps have an after hours discussion, because help would be very much appreciated. As I said, it takes, to really effectively critique anyone's work, it takes a fair bit of time, because you need to immerse yourself in it, understand it, and then critique it. It's more enjoyable setting out one's own vision or doing one's own work. But certainly when I've got the draft of the projected paperback together, some criticism will be good. If anyone, your organization obviously happens to be sitting on a few thousand Bitcoin or something, let me know. But I'm guessing that no one was so provident, but I don't know. I mean, on a personal note, part of me, I see various colleagues who have got full-blown institutes and so on. I think one can do so much more as a tightly knit team organization, but that takes proper funding. Bills need to be paid, organization. That's something to consider for the future. I mean, I would love to see, institutes of paradise engineering, and there are other groups, Invincible Wellbeing, a colleague is running, my friend Andre's Crania Research Institute, who do share this kind of vision of a world without suffering. But as I said, the transhumanist movement itself, Humanity Plus continues to do good work, organizes conferences, but I would love to see the transhumanist movement show greater unity, so that we could, without apology or embarrassment or qualification, tell the rest of the world we believe this, rather than explaining all the different currents in transhumanism.
Well said. Well said. That is awesome. In terms of finding help for you, just because, if I understand right, that was for critique as you get closer to putting out your paperback book, right? Yes. I think that as that time approaches, we can definitely line up that help for you. So that should be doable. Just reach out to me or Nick, and we'll make it happen. So I think that actually does it. Let me just check for any further questions now.
If anyone has questions that they don't feel have been properly answered, we can do follow-ups or anything like that, or get in contact. So apologies to anyone who feels that we have ignored the key issue. It's always really tough, because we got actually a surprisingly large number of questions. Some of them overlap, some of them we wound up covering anyway, and it's just a little bit hard to make sure that we covered everything. We'll give out your contact information if that sounds okay, and just make sure that that's cool.
Awesome. Absolutely. Okay, so I think that will do it here. To all of our viewers, thank you so much for joining us here at the Futurist Foundation, and our wonderful discussion with David Pearce. We really appreciate you coming and asking questions. This is a really wonderful discussion. Like we were just talking about, we'll give out David's contact info if you have questions that we can get to. And also, well, if you have 1,000 Bitcoins, please give them to David. If you have a few bucks, then and you have them to spare, then we would like to ask you to please kindly consider supporting the Futurist Foundation. And the link for that donation mechanism will be at the bottom of this video description, because that support makes events like this and other activities possible. So thank you so much to everyone here, and thank you, David, for joining us. This is great.
Thank you, Michael, and your colleagues at the Futurist Foundation. Onwards, infinite bliss, and thank you again. And